brilliant to see everyone. Folks, just as Sue said, let's get to know each other a little bit. So do feel free. We've got such a great group of people from loads of different time zones and different parts of the world. So I will try and slow down. It normally takes me a day or two when I'm abroad training to realize I'm from Ireland, and I tend to speak very fast, particularly something that I'm passionate about. So welcome, folks. It is lovely to see so many people and to see the interest in this as well. As Sue says, reach out to us at the end if you need to know more about anything that I'm going to talk about this morning. Let me know. Get in contact through LinkedIn, Twitter. Feel free to tweet us at Leadership Institute, and my own Twitter's there as well, before, during the session as well, folks. I love this. I think we've got pretty much most continents at the minute this morning, everywhere from Donegal to the Philippines and Italy. I love it, folks. Absolutely love it. Brilliant. So I'm not going to keep you any more than 1 hour, 60 minutes. And what I want to do in this session this morning is this. A little bit about myself, first of all. So my name is Enda Young, and I'm one of the program directors at the William J. Clinton Leadership Institute. As Sue said, we're part of the School of Management at Queen's University. For me, I often joke with the groups that I train that I am a recovering mechanical engineer. That was my first degree. And about almost 20 years ago, a group of people trainers from Mediation Northern Ireland came in and did a one-day training session just before I started university, and on this thing called mediation. And I was like, wow, well, what is that? And how do I do that for the rest of my life? So I finished my degree in engineering. I went back and did a degree in conflict resolution in theory, culture, and identity. And I've been lucky to have then spent the last few years of my life working. I cut my teeth, I guess, working in community-based mediation to many organizations in this part of the world, and working on interfaces, and I'm privileged to work with a lot of really fantastic community-based organizations. As well as community-based mediation, then I've done a lot of workplace mediation, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. So I work with a lot of workplace mediation organizations, and I've done a lot of training everywhere from Dubai to Malaysia, and cut my teeth working with some of the big companies in the world over the last few years in particular. I am an accredited mediator with the Mediation Institute of Ireland and the International Mediation Institute. I actually paid my fees to both, or to one this year. Mediation Ireland folks, I'll get to you soon. And I'm an accredited coach as well with AOEC and the Association for Coaching. And I love coaching, and I see a huge connection between mediation and coaching, in terms of principles and in terms of the belief systems behind them. And I'll chat a little bit about that, particularly around conflict coaching, or as I call it, mediative coaching. So folks, welcome everyone. And we have well over 200 people on the call this morning, so that's fantastic. So what am I going to talk about over the next little while? So I want to look at what are some of the common causes for conflict in the workplace. I want to then explore what effective ways do we have to deal with this. Obviously, I'm going to focus on mediation this morning, but I'm going to focus on mediation, particularly around workplace and a little bit of community, particularly workplace mediation, and then thinking wider, thinking for all leaders. How do we think mediatively, not just about mediation? And we'll hopefully have some time at the end for Q&A. And apologies if I don't get a chance to get the Q&A before we finish today. I will absolutely get back to you as much as I can. So feel free to drop in questions. And people reach out to me all the time on LinkedIn and emails as well. So that's what we're here for in the Institute, to be a resource to you. And I'm going to finish doing some top tips that I think that are useful for everyone in terms of how do we use this thing called mediation and the principles behind it. So it's a little bit of context, first of all. So the CBI about 5 years ago did a great report, and what they said was, actually, when they looked at it and at a rough estimate, talking about 33 billion per year is wasted in the UK due to conflict. Huge number of days lost, the people being off, the stress that causes, how many months. I'm sure you've experienced this in your own workplace, or you've seen that, what happens when someone's off, the emotional stress and strain that individual's under. But then what happens back at work? You know, can that organization afford to backfill their position? The retraining that goes on, and then what happens when they come back to the workplace? And one of the questions about this as well then is what happens to people when they come back? As I said, what happens? How do they interact and connect with individuals, because what's happened to the relationships that they were there for? And I will speak of it, so we're not a problem at all. And the slides will be made available as well, folks. And when we look in the Republic of Ireland, 1 in 4 Irish employees experience workplace each year, you know, and the average hours lost can be up towards 3 3 hours a week. Now, when you scale that up with your team, with your organization, with your function, the impact that that has, obviously financially, but fundamentally on the relationship and fundamentally on the emotions of a place. And I love this report. There's a brilliant report out this time last year by the ICIPD. And there was 3 standout points of this report for me. The first bit was it said this. Actually, it's about 49%, almost 50% of people actually think of mediation favorably. They would like to use it. But it's a huge underused part of the HR toolbox, in my opinion. And there are loads of different complex reasons for that in this part of the world and in other different parts of the world as well. I love this. More organizations should invest in ensuring their managers are capable and confident. And I think that's one of the huge things that has come out for me over the years is there's one thing saying that there's conflict resolution and there's mediation techniques. There's another thing in skilling our managers, our leaders, our teachers, our politicians up in actually the basics of conflict resolution to the more advanced, I guess, theories and practices that can be useful to us. And fundamentally, the one big takeaway from that report for me was this. There could be a real opportunity here for organizations that embrace this. When they did this particular piece of research, again, 5 years previously, what they found was actually not a lot has changed. The issues are still there. The conflicts are still there. How we deal with each other and the emotions and the hurt and the pain is still there. Mediation's still there. It's just not being used as much as it could be. And as I'll come on to a little bit later on, I don't think mediation is this magic bullet for all conflicts for a whole load of reasons, but actually the fundamental principles should be enshrined in every organization and how we listen, how we talk, how we communicate, how we interact with each other, and never more so now than when we're dealing with each other, many of us online. What has that done to how we communicate? And hello to everyone just joining us as well, folks. Lovely. So what are the most common causes then? I mean, you can think back to your own workplace. You think back to where you've been working over your career. And I love this. One of the single most important causes of conflict, and I see this over and over again, is the clash in personalities, right? Personality styles. Maybe you love conflict, right? And don't get me wrong. I'm a huge believer in thinking conflict in itself is not inherently negative, right? It's not inherently negative. The outworkings can be incredibly destructive, but actually conflict is healthy or can be healthy. Think back to your own life. Think back to the people, your good friends, the people that you love, those people who you've been with you throughout life, right? That you're a real strong bond with. Chances are you have a healthy level of conflict with them, right? You're able to talk through things, discuss and disagree in a way that's healthy. But we also know that that can drift into unhealthy conflict. That can drift into bullying and anxiety and all of the outworkings of that. The most common behavioral associated with that is a lack of respect in the workplace for you, for your how you communicate, lack of respect for you just being in that place, right? And the consequences are huge. I've touched on many of them already, but fundamentally, we're talking about stress, right? We're talking about a drop in motivation and productivity in that level, drop in commitment. Who wants to work in a place like that, right? And fundamentally, the cost to the individual, that anxiety. And what the research finds is those in that level of anxiety, that break in relationship, those really tough emotions, they can stay with people for years. Sometimes I've worked in mediations which there are a day. The phone calls we do beforehand, we're on in and out in one day, and we're done. Well, I think the longest mediation I've worked on, community-based sort of facilitative mediation, was 7 years, right? And some of the mediations I've worked on go back much, much, much further, can go back generations, right? And what I see in workplaces as well is those things can be complex. I've worked in workplaces where 2 managers have fallen out, for example, and the stories of the conflict are pervasive and has fragmented the team. Maybe 2 functions have now completely split. Half this team support one manager and half the team support the other manager. And I've actually been in workplaces where the managers, neither of them work in that team anymore. And yet the conflict and the story still remains and the fragmentation still remains. So when we're dealing with conflict, quite often, we're not just dealing with the 2 individuals, we're dealing with the legacy of the stories. And what does that do to the teams with which you work in? So we need to be thinking systemically around conflict, not just about the 2 individuals. Sometimes it is just about the two, but sometimes you need to be thinking wider. So what do we do about it? So there are numerous processes. I don't see any of these are better or worse than the others. And some of this comes back to time, some of this comes back to skill, some of this comes back to culture. And culture is a huge element in this as well, both culture with a big C, depending on what part of the world you're from. Is it an elder-based process in terms of organizational structures to resolve conflict? Are people just told to leave it? Do they actually leave it? Or have you built, some organizations, for our own organization, as a listening culture where people are able to actually have those conversations, both formally and informally? So the alternative dispute resolution scale, what we're talking about at one level, we've got negotiation, we've got facilitation. Etymology of the word to facilitate is to make things easy, right? And then we've got mediation. As we go up that scale to the right, we go to counsel and experts and arbitration litigation. I do believe some people just need their day in court, by the way. If people are being bullied, by all means, we need to go through formal grievance procedures. If there's something that's been very detrimental to that individual, maybe mediation isn't appropriate. And I'll come on back to that in a few minutes as well. So by all means, those processes need to remain there. And yet, when in a conflict do we have that conversation? Do we have it early on? And quite often, we train in the mediation, we say the best time for mediation sometimes can be early on. But rarely am I asked in as a professional mediator, or any of my colleagues are asked in to mediate early on. It's normally when the damage is done, right? You can still mediate then, because mediation is about the relationships, but actually how much time and energy and has been wasted, how much emotion and deep-seated raw conflict is there, raw emotion is still there, right? So for me, that left-hand side is a really interesting place to be. And there are differences. There are subtle differences and some not so subtle differences between negotiation and mediation, for example. Negotiation can tend to be between me and you. Doesn't tend to be external parties involved, right? Whereas mediation can nearly always has to be about having an external, impartial third party involved, okay? And they are there not, and this is critical, I'll come back to this, not to give you, if you're in that conflict, answers, but to facilitate you to find your own answers with the other person or the other people that you're in conflict with. And I'll come back to that in a little bit as well. I'm going to go into a little bit more details. So on that spectrum, what is mediation then? So as I said, I'm an accredited mediator with the Mediation Institute of Ireland, and I love this definition they have. Mediation is a process in which an independent, impartial mediator assists two or more disputing parties in resolving the dispute in a collaborative, consensual manner. In a nutshell, that's what mediation is in the formal setting, okay? And I think it's a nice place to start. So let me go a little bit deeper with that. First of all, let's start with what it isn't. It's not counseling, okay? It's not a past focused process. Quite often what we tend to do is maybe the first time we meet someone as a mediator, we tend to hear a little bit obviously about the past. We tend to think, where are they now? And ultimately the focus though, and the clear bit is the focus tends to be on the future relationship, the future working arrangements and things like that, for example. But it's not counseling. We're not here to hear about, people's childhoods and things like that. And it's very clear that's another skill set. It's a very different process. So one of the first things we do, and it's the same as coaching as well, was we're very clear what counseling isn't. Arbitration. It's not arbitration. It's not about you hearing me and then hearing the other and me and another third party making the decision for us. The beautiful thing I love about mediation is the decision and the outcome and the solution is owned by those in conflict, is owned by those in conflict. And it's not about the mediator. The mediator's ego needs to be removed, right? It's not about them because they go home at the end of the day, right? It's about the people left in. And quite often what I say to people is, yeah, do you know what? Mediators can listen to two individuals. I mean, two individuals who have had huge issues, and they can go, if only they would do this as a mediator, they can think, if only maybe they'd move desk, if only they'd move office, if only there's many options that the mediator goes through mediators' heads sometimes, right? And the key to mediation is though is holding back on that, because I can give a solution to the problem and people will nod their head and say, yeah, that's great. And they might try it, they might not. But ultimately, as I said, I go home. But if the ownership over that solution is left with those people in conflict, then it's much more likely to hold. It's much more likely to actually work. It's much more likely to have a direct impact on that relationship in reality, not just in theory, not just on a form somewhere. And the other critical thing about mediation in this sense as well, folks, is usually not legally binding, particularly in a workplace perspective and a community perspective as well. And that, I mean, it can be, it's not a legal outcome. Sometimes it can be a moral outcome, but that, and contracts become signed and things between individuals, but it's not a legal process in terms of what we're talking about workplace mediation. So what are some of the advantages then? It's quicker and cheaper than formal litigation, right? Once we tend to get lawyers, solicitors, people like that involved, money tends to go out. There are times where that is needed. Do not hear me wrong. There are absolutely times, I think, where that'll always be needed, right? And yet, when we look at what we want in terms of the relationship, then mediation can be a fantastic process. And as I said, why is it fantastic? Because ownership stays where it should. It doesn't go to an external party. It stays with the people who have had the conflict. And one of the reasons I love mediation is it can help restore those relationships. It's difficult. It can be really emotional. It takes a lot of courage. And when it works, it works. And why does it work though as well? Because people feel listened to. And I'll come back to listening. And any mediation training I'll do anywhere in the world, any conflict resolution training, at its core will have listening. And I mean that in a non-patronizing sense, because listening is a fundamental tool. I'm a professional mediator, but sometimes a terrible listener, just ask my wife sometimes, right? But yet it's a skill that we all can work on, and I work on every day. And the other thing I love about mediation is that it encourages creativity. It helps people think outside the box, put the Bono green hat on, think about a new way of being in that place. Thinking about getting two heads or getting groups of people together in a way, and it's up to the mediator to help to facilitate that creativity. And I'm never cease to be surprised by how creative individuals tend to be when they're in the right place at the right time. And mediation is all about timing. I often think mediators are kind of like stand-up comedians, right? Yeah, it's all about the timing. I can read you a joke by somebody like Billy Connolly or pick a good comedian from your country, right? I can read it verbatim and I can try and deliver it right now in the webinar and there'll be silence, right? Because why? Because I might not have the timing right. I definitely would have the timing right? So mediation, sometimes I've seen going into organizations where it's the right process, but at the wrong time. Maybe that individual, that leader, that manager, that staff member's not quite ready for it yet. And maybe we come back a few weeks, a few months down the line, and that's when it can be a really useful mechanism at times. So what are the principles? What is underneath this thing of mediation? Well, fundamentally, it's a voluntary process. And all parties need to agree to mediation. And there's different ways of thinking about that and different structures and different cultures. But fundamentally, there should be some level of voluntary commitment here. Voluntary commitment from those individuals who are in that conflict. They can choose to walk away from mediation at any stage. Also voluntary for the mediator. If he or she feels that this is going nowhere, that there's a waste of time and all of that, then they can walk away. But as long as everyone knows that that voluntary commitment is there and it's clear. And one of the critical aspects of mediation is confidentiality. Confidentiality. What is said in that room stays in that room unless there is explicit permission given. So if as an external mediator, if I'm invited into places, the first thing is mediation agreements and talking about that idea of confidentiality. Who buys me in to do a mediation and who knows the outcome out of that? So confidentiality is critical. As an internal mediator for our university at times as well, confidentiality is critical as well. And I do believe you can absolutely use internal mediators within your organizations at times. And there are times when that might not be appropriate, when things are a little bit too close to home. And there have been times where I've been too close to mediations where I haven't been appropriate as well. And critically, the mediator is impartial and does not take sides. So the mediator does not take sides. And in the real world, that's tough because impartiality doesn't just come back to you and your capabilities and your ability to be impartial. Fundamentally, it comes back to the perception of your impartiality. So you as a leader or manager might be a fantastic mediator. You might actually be a trained professional mediator now working in a different context and managing a great group of people. But you might be perceived to be impartial. You might be perceived that there's a clash within cultures, within your staff team between two individuals. The perception might be that you're just too close to it, that you're too close to one individual because you've worked with them for longer than the other person, for example. So perception becomes a huge critical part of mediation. And the other two reasons I love about mediation in terms of the principles is it's solution focused and it's agreement focused. So yeah, we do want to hear a little bit about the past and how people got to where they're at, but fundamentally it's about where are we going next? What's going to happen now? And as all of these things, the devil becomes in the detail. Who's going to do that? Where's it going to happen? Who's going to pay for it? All of those kind of things come into a mediation agreement. And the parties themselves, and I'm going to come back to this over and over again, the parties themselves offer the solution. It's not about the mediator. It's not about how they think things should be solved. It's about those individuals. And that for me is one of the lovely places where mediation really connects with coaching. Because as a coach, one of the fundamental beliefs is I don't have the answer as the coach. That individual knows what they need. And it's up to me to help them find that, but they have the answer themselves. And there's a strong connection for me between coaching and executive coaching in that sense and mediation for those reasons. So let me just quickly give you a process of mediation, folks. And listen, different books, different theories will have different numbers in their process, right? Family mediation, civic mediation, civil mediation will all be subtly different for different reasons. I'm going to give you a very quick 5-stage process of mediation, just to give you an overview of what each stage is. There are 6 stages, there are 7 stages, and but for the sake of today, just a quick one in terms of an overview. So separate meetings. So let's take an example of a workplace where 2 individuals, 2 managers have fallen out, and now we went to an external mediator organization, for example. And I will come back to internal mediation in a few minutes, folks, as well, and what you can do as a leader without actually going to formal mediation. But quite often I teach formal mediation because once we get the concepts, then we can do other things with that, right? So first of all, there'd be separate meetings with the mediator. Those can be over the phone, over Zoom, over Teams, whatever works in the real world. And I do believe in online mediation. It isn't at times as good, in my opinion, sometimes as face-to-face mediation, particularly for very difficult and transient emotional conflicts. And yet, I think Zoom is a fantastic way of doing it. The breakout rooms functions and things like that are fantastic for online mediation. And there's been a lot of great organizations out there doing online mediation for years. So does it work? Yes, in my opinion. So separate meetings, virtually, digitally, or in the real world. To hear people's stories, to explain what mediation is, and to get permission to proceed. And never underestimate the power of listening to someone's conflict and story. And I often think it's an absolute privilege to hear that at times, because as a mediator, that could be the first time that individual has said how difficult things have been for them. And also what I've seen over the years is conflict can take over people. Conflict can absolutely take over people's lives, right? So something that may be perceived to be small to you in a workplace conflict even, can absolutely be incredibly destructive for that individual. They might not be sleeping at night. They might be having, issues with relationships at home because of what they're being through. So I often say to people, you never know who's been in a room, right? You never know what they've seen at home or what they've been through in a cultural sense as well. And then we hope to get to a facilitated joint meeting. That can be obviously in the same day, that can be days later, where we get people to hear each other's stories. And that can be the treatment where we have tissues, where there's an awful lot of emotions, where there can be anger, and it's up to the facilitator to facilitate those real emotions, to hear what the other side is saying, to hear from their map of the world what they see or what they saw. And then we try and frame the issues, not just the positions here, right? Not just the positions, but the interests and the needs, really what's underneath the surface of whatever has happened in that. Has it been about the emails or has it been about a lack of respect? Right, about on how that has landed for those individuals in terms of, has it been about how they were talked to at those meetings, or has it been a sense of a removal of autonomy, for example? And then we try and get to some level of creative solutions. And that's one of the stages which I love. And that can be on a flip chart. That can be if we're doing it online through mind maps or through some of those lovely interactive collaborative platforms like Miro and things like that. When we brainstorm out there and we try and come up, they try and come up, whoever they are, not me as a mediator, but they try and come up with solutions that work for them in reality. And then we obviously come up with some type of an agreement, written, verbal, whatever works for those individuals in that one time. But they come up with that, okay? And as I said, there are subtleties with different mediation processes. Some mediation processes will favor some of these much more. There'll be negotiation in the middle of this, but I'm giving a large overview, and I'm sure many people on the call will be familiar with this or other versions of the process. But I think it's useful just when I talk about mediation to frame that a little bit. I said I come back to this, folks. Magic Hat. This was in my head because this is the one I bought our son at Christmas. I should have said at the start, we have a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old, folks. So if there's any conflicts or squealing or shouting going on outside, it's completely set up for this webinar, okay? So mediation is not a magic bullet. As I've already said, I think sometimes people just need their day in court. For example, people need sometimes just not to work there anymore, right? If somebody has had a horrific bullying experience, is it appropriate to get them in a room with with their person who's bullied them for months or years? Possibly not, because one of the fundamental principles of mediation is do no harm. Will we make the situation worse for those individuals? And the magic bullet element, as I said, it might not be the right time for the mediation. It might not be the right process. You might not be the right mediator, right? And that's a trickier one. So timing, personalities, and this idea that actually mediation is not a substitute for formal grievances. When it works well, in my opinion, mediation is there to run in parallel, to be a part of that, to be an optional extra for those processes. And I'll come back to that before we finish today as well. So I love mediation. I think it's a fantastic process. I think the principles and the skill base underneath it are fantastic. And yet, I think that there's a time and a place for it. So, a few things. Question for you right now when you're sitting on this webinar this morning. Is mediation written into your formal discipline and grievance procedures? Because if it's not, it should be as an optional stage, right? So is that there? I mean, I remember working years ago with a mediation organization, and it turns out mediation actually wasn't part of their formal grievance procedures, right? And it was later on when we discovered, but by default, sometimes, particularly for big organizations and the legacy of different HR issues or whatever that might not be. So double check. If it's not, it should be. And as I've already said, mediation is not there to replace those formal processes. It should complement them. And the last thing I'd love to say about this, folks, as well, is when we think about putting mediation into organizational structures or other alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, think systemically, always think systemically. And what I mean by that is this: I've seen really good organizations, mediation organizations with really good staff teams go into massive big contracts in mediation and it not just quite working. And why? Because they haven't tried to implement mediation and alternative dispute processes within the organizational culture. They haven't thought about the change management. They haven't thought about, does it look like if I go to mediation, am I accepting blame? Have they thought about the perceptions of the mediation process? Have they thought about the history? All of that. So what I would often say to people is when we think about mediation within organizations, we need to think about the wider connections. We need to think about how HR is talking to people on the ground, or talking to the board, or is talking to senior management. The perceptions of mediation will make or break if that process is successful within your organization. And when it becomes part of that, it becomes part of the language that we choose to use. And once it becomes part of the language, then we can see real change. Then we can see staff retention levels, people staying in their job, people being happier with where they work, people not going home with butterflies in their stomach because of who said what that day. A few things I said I come back to as well. I want to talk about internal versus external. Sometimes you do need an external mediator from another organization to come in. I fundamentally believe that, regardless of the skill level within your team right now, because sometimes we need people outside of our system to see things differently. Sometimes we just need another set of eyes. Sometimes we need that real impartiality, okay? And that can happen for a load of different reasons. But as I said, sometimes internally, I do believe that at times internal mediators are fantastic. As I said, I'm an internal mediator for our own university, and I have done cases internally. Well, part of the reason for that is our Riddle Hall, it's a beautiful building. It's a little bit further out from the rest of the university. You know, we have a lot of staff within the university, obviously, so I don't tend to be as connected to other parts of the university. So, and fundamentally, if you're ever in doubt, ask the question. Those people who are going to be invited to mediation, how do they feel about you? And ask in a way that they can give a genuine answer, because we can all ask a question to get the answer that we want. But is that real mediation? Is that real for those individuals in that moment in time? And then there's formal and informal mediation. So absolutely, we train formal mediation, you know, in terms of the stage processes, in terms of connection to the organizations such as the Mediation Institute of Ireland and others, you know. But the informal bit as well is the bit that I'm tends to be more interested in at times. And it's that idea, how do we then take these issues of mediation, how do we take them and broaden that out? How do we amplify those in a way that actually helps all organizations? And they're not mutually exclusive, but how do we actually use mediation then with many of us? So to do that, what I often say to people is think mediative, not just mediation. So by all means, have mediation in your grievance project processes and procedures. By all means, have that as an option for individuals, internal or external mediators. Right? And yet, how do you as a leader, how do you as a manager act mediative every day? How much do you listen? I mean, really listen. How much have you listened over the last 12 months of this pandemic, right? Because many people I've been working with are working harder than ever, or under more pressure and stress than ever. And we haven't maybe been able to maybe pop our head around the door and have those conversations, those informal conversations, which can take the heat down of things. So are you leaving time within your schedule to pick up on those fractures before they split, right? How many informal conversations have you been able to have with your team over the last 12 months, wherever in the world you are? And we do a whole training course over looking at how have you set your room up? Do you have good lighting? Do you have good cameras? Are they HD? What are your microphones like? And I use that for a reason, because when we are using the online world, and I said I'm a big believer in it, the closer we can make the online experience to the real world, the more likely we are to pick up on the subtleties of micro expressions of body language and all of that. So by all means, let's try and close that gap as much as we can, recognizing that the gap will probably still remain. And I talked about coaching, and I'm a huge believer in conflict coaching or mediative coaching, and it works. It can work before a mediation, it can work during a mediation, it can work after a mediation, and it can work instead of a mediation at times. And it's coaching, but in a way that's focused on the conflict, that it's focused on, I call it mediative coaching, because it's then focused on this idea of what do we do next, the forward focus, how do you deal with conflict, and the inner focus of maybe working with one individual to help them get over a particular point in time. So I think it's a huge process and a hugely beneficial process. So I said I'd come back to this. I want to do 7 top tips, and there are many tips, folks. I've got a 2-day course, or I've got a 5-day course in mediation, which I've run out in Malaysia a few times, right? So trying to pack everything into an hour or 60 minutes is always fun. So forgive me, there are many others, but when I was preparing the webinar, I thought, here's 7 that I would love you to take away. And if I can make your life that little bit easier within 1 hour, then that's been a decent use of your time this morning. And if you're watching this on YouTube later on, I hope that these are useful for you. So the first thing I tell to everyone is stay mindful of your own lenses. And I love this old saying, we do not see things as they are, we see things as we are. And I think we forget that as leaders or managers under apparel. And I love this image. Anyone who's done any training courses with me over the years, I was lucky to spend some time at a Rotary Fellowship in Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok a few years ago. And this exhibition was on next door, and I've become obsessed with this guy's work over the years. Philippe Rament, and he's a French sculptor. He doesn't use Photoshop in any of his imagery. And this particular image is of Hong Kong Harbour. He took about 2.5 weeks apparently to get this shot together, and he nearly died because the thing flipped into the water, right? But he has spent his entire career, decades of his career, playing with people's sense of perception, people's sense of the world. And I often use this image to start, using optical illusions and training and things like that, but to start focusing people on how do you see the world right now, today? And are you sure you see it that way, right? And I also love this image. I mean, I think the biggest group I've had is about 500 people in the room, and you have about 400 people just going like this, right? Go, what am I looking at and why? So staying mindful. I know you know this. I know that you know about, how you see things, but sometimes our ability to see ourselves, sometimes our ability to help others see themselves can be the first thing to go when we're under pressure, right? Is the first thing to slip when we've got too much on. When we are under pressure to get something in by close of play Friday, when we're under financial pressures, when we're under just the pressures of the pandemic and everything that's come with that, looking after people at home or whatever that is. So the ability to actually genuinely think and put yourself in the shoes of others is a fundamental thing that shifts at times, in my opinion. So it's about coming back to that, regardless of where you are in your career, right? And I love this saying as well. So let's remember, reminding yourselves that the map is not the territory. So how we see the world isn't the way it really is. And we know that cognitively, but sometimes we forget that emotionally, right? So what I often say to people then is, so then meet people in their map of the world. And people will give you clues all of the time about, in my opinion, for their map of the world. Anyone who's done sales training will recognize hearing metaphor and repeating metaphor. So if someone says, do you hear what I'm saying? Repeating back, yeah, I hear what you mean. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah, I see what you mean. And that matching of metaphor, for example, is one quick, short way of doing two things. One, of establishing rapport with that individual faster, and that's just fundamental to mediative communication and mediation, is that person will then feel listened to a little bit more, because they will have heard their own language played back to them. So it can help with the establishment of relationship and rapport. And fundamentally, mediation is about helping people feel heard. And I don't know about you, but if I think back to the best leaders and managers that I've worked with over the years, they're people who have helped. When I think back to them, regardless of every other issue, regardless of the ins and outs and the to and fro of the workplace, they're people that when I left that room, I felt listened to by them. And that is absolutely critical, in my opinion, in terms of conflict in general, and in terms of how we deal with each other as people, wherever in the world we are. We can still disagree, but we can listen. Third, explore your own and your team's conflict style. And listen, there's a few different mechanisms out there to explore that. One of the best ones that I've come across is a Thomas Kilman. I'm sure many of you are aware of that at the TKI. Do the assessment on you. Do it twice. See what it comes up with. You take it, in my opinion, with a pinch of salt. And what I would often say to people, they're fantastic resources. They work really well. And yet sometimes those things become in flux, in my opinion. But for me, I use them as a way to start people doing a deep dive on themselves. Do you like conflict? Do you do everything you can to run at it, right? Culturally, is it part of your culture? Is it part of you, genetics? Is it part of your makeup? Is it part of your experience? Do you get a bit of a buzz from it, right? A bit of an adrenaline rush? Or the opposite side of that, do you do everything you can just to go away from it? Do you absolutely hate conflict? And are you just, listen, I don't want, whatever, and just walking away at all times? So how do you deal with conflict? And what does your gut say? And fundamentally, the theory behind a lot of these date back to the work from the 60s in terms of the managerial framework. But fundamentally, when we look at our own style, it says this: most of us tend to have a default way of dealing with conflict that we go back to when we're tired, when we're in a global pandemic, when our emotional resilience is low. And we tend to go back to maybe you collaborate or compromise as a default, right? Maybe that's just who you are. And yet we can act in ways out of that. Just because you're one style does not mean you're the other, because we should be able to flex consciously or subconsciously. But one of the other days is that you can absolutely work really well out of what may tend to be your natural style. But there tends to be a consequence, right? You tend to go home every day or stay home every day, absolutely tired or wrecked. So then what do you do about that? What is your self-care mechanism? And one of the things I often say to people in mediation, what are you doing to look after you? The last time you went for a run or read a good book or did some meditation, whatever that might be, So explore yours. And then the beautiful thing about that is help your team explore theirs. Because like any of those good psychometric analysis that work really well, regardless of the, of the underlying ethos of them, they tend to then change the language of an organization. Everyone then starts talking in the same language. And that becomes incredibly helpful, particularly when we're looking at a systemic way of dealing with conflict within organizations. Last three. I love this one. Never underestimate the power of the small things. It's one maxim I've operated under for years. So what I mean by that is the small things make huge differences within organizational structures, right? Small things, spending actually a bit of time outside of formal conversations, in terms of doing your teamwork, in terms of connecting with people. When we had offices, did you give people good coffee? Right? Good coffee. Or was it the cheap coffee, right? And it goes more mediating with people, what's the space like, and the natural light and the temperature and the chairs and all of those things, because they matter. I often joke, I remember years ago, I went up to volunteer in a place when I was a kid, and I went in and the director took me aside, made me good coffee, ground the beans, sat me down for 20 minutes, and I just went up there to volunteer. But because of how that individual made me feel, I ended up walking away and coming back and working there for 3 years because of how that individual made me feel. And I remember another individual as well, every time we went into his office to have a meeting, the monitor would go off and the Bluetooth keyboard and everything would be pushed in. And the chair would swivel about 30 or 40 degrees. And you were the only person in that room at that moment in time. So that small thing of moving the keyboard in and switching the monitor off made a huge difference to how I felt. Still might disagree with me. I still might have walked away, but I walked away feeling listened to. And I want to put two more right there, folks. I love this one. This comes from the book of Difficult Conversations, and I'll reference it in 2 seconds on my next slide. Move, I love this, move from certainty to curiosity, because curiosity is a way into their story. It's a way, and what I mean by that is all of us have had emails by people or texts or WhatsApp, and we look at it and go, really? Really? But actually, if we stay curious, if we invite ourselves to stay curious and go, why would they send that for? What happened last night at home for them? What pressures are they going under during what we're going through at the minute? And staying curious as to the intention behind their action. If we as leaders and managers can do that, then we can encourage our staff to do that as well. So curiosity is a way into their story, and stories, as we all know, are a huge, huge part of conflict. What is their story? Because I guarantee you their story is different than your story if you've been in conflict in that moment in time with them. And the reference in that book is there, folks. I love it. I still think it's one of the better, or one of the best difficult conversation books out there. And one other thing I love to live on in this is this is disentangle. Even that word is great, isn't it? Disentangle impact from intention. Remember doing a mediation recently, and we finally got these 2 individuals into a room, and chatting to them. They were we had done all the pre-work, we'd done loads of meetings, we were going through a big sort of joint first meeting with them. And one individual, this had been, the things that got so bad that one individual had left work, and the mediation was part of the return to work package. Okay. And it was voluntary, and people wanted to be there because they knew they wanted to both work in that place, but yet they wanted to retain some semblance of relationship. So skip forward a few hours, have them in a room. One individual says, and when you sent that WhatsApp at 9 o'clock on that Friday night, it made me feel, right? It made me feel terrible. And all of the deep emotions that came out at that moment in time. The other person sitting in the room at the same time with me. And that other person's genuinely, their jaw started going down a bit, right? And their eyes become wide, and people start to dilate. And they're going, and when that individual stops talking, they're going, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean that. It was a joke. The impact and the intention gap was so big, it fractured that relationship. Obviously, loads of stuff came before that in that particular story, but that one thing was enough to, the straw that broke the camel's back. We have language that describes this, right? But yet that one sentence, and what part of the mediation role, whether it's formal or informal, for me, is about closing that gap between impact and intention. When you sent that email, how did it really land? And did you think about that before you sent it, right? That idea of having buts and ands and replacing as many buts and sentences as we can with ands, all of that helps with impact and intention. And I want to finish off on this, folks, in terms of refinement. And I said I would come back to this as well. Fundamentally, good communication, good mediation is about listening. And let's be honest, most of us, most of the time, we're just waiting to talk, right? When we're listening to people, and for a load of good reasons, And when somebody says something to us, we're tending to got to listen and deconstruct. Sometimes we're thinking about why they are wrong and I am right. I'm thinking about how to get into their argument, to deconstruct it, to be clever or whatever that might be. But actually, what's happening is they're still talking, right? And that gap, when training mediators and negotiators, it's about recognizing the gap exists for all of us, and it's about trying to close that. So putting the tongue to the roof of your mouth for some people can help disengage that part of your brain responsible for speech. Sometimes for some people, or just repeating those words that you hear of that individual that they're saying in real time in your inner dialogue to help you focus on each and every word. And let's be honest, it's difficult. It's difficult if you don't like them or they don't like you. It's difficult if you're under pressure. It's difficult for a whole numerous load of reasons. But I think fundamentally, I keep coming back to this. And I love this model. I've taken it from hostage negotiators, and for anyone who's on the call, I think there's an awful lot to be learned from the word of hostage negotiation in terms of how we as individuals deal with each other. And I love this model. And it says, and hostage negotiators have been using this for years. And the basics of it are this: if we want to change individuals' behavior, well, the first thing we need to be able to do is influence them. To be able to influence them, we must have some level of rapport, and rapport can only be there at times when we have a level of empathy, not sympathy, empathy. But all of that in the first place is prefaced on our ability to actively listen in real time to that individual. And the reason I love this is for any of us as managers, leaders, wherever we're at, becoming formal, informal mediators. If everything goes sideways, if you're really struggling, if something hits you with something, you're like, I really don't know what to do with this, go back to listening. Go back down the stairway, because that's fundamentally how we create better organizations, better systems that are able to deal more proactively and productively with conflict. Not just theoretically, but we create places that people want to work in. We create places that people want to get up every morning and be proud to be in, regardless of how much stress and how much pressure and the intricacies of our work. And I'm going to finish up with this. For me, conflict resolution and mediation training should be as common as fire safety training. William Ury did a lovely TED talk a few years back, and he says that he believes that listening skills should be taught in every school. I fundamentally agree with that, and I will go a little bit further as well. I would say that every time we start a new organization, we should be trained in the basics of conflict. We should be trained in the basics of who we are as conflictual individuals, the perception of ourselves, and basic mediation techniques. And I think we would see a huge shift and change in our organization, in our vocabulary, and our ability to be together with individuals in a better way. So folks, thank you. Tons of questions here on the side, so thanks for that. We're not going to get to all of them. We will definitely get to some now. All slides we've made available. This will be up on YouTube as we finish. And genuinely, I said it at the start, but if you need me for anything, reach out to me, give you a shout, as many of you already done on LinkedIn as well. I really appreciate that. We're here as a resource for you. I love this kind of work. And if you need anything else from us, let us know. And before we do that, let's do a couple of questions here as we go. And let's talk a little bit about what else you can do with us as we go as well. Sue.
Brilliant, Enda. Thanks so much. And the chat function is literally on fire for the last 45 minutes. Superb interaction. And from everyone that's joined around the world, and I know that some of you aren't able to stay for the next 10 or 15 minutes, as Enda said, you can access the video from our website, from our YouTube channel, follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and you'll see the updates. And we'd love to hear from you, love to get your feedback on Twitter and LinkedIn. So for those that have to leave, thanks a million for joining us this morning. So some questions, Enda. We had a LinkedIn attendee group going for a few weeks before the event this morning, and we had some questions from the group. So if we run through those first, and then we'll get to some of those that were in chat. So, Enda, the first one comes from a human resource manager. Obviously, this subject's very close to their heart, and obviously with everything that's happening in COVID. When do you consider it's not appropriate for a line manager to mediate a dispute for their direct reports?
Brilliant question, and it's a classic question. So one, there's never, in my opinion, a hard and set time. And I think once we demarcate that, it gets a little bit tricky. First thing is to ask people themselves in a way that they can actually say no. Um, Deconstruct it and think back. If you weren't doing the mediation, do you think, and there's a whole checklist I can give you as well that goes through that, do you think you're the right person? If it wasn't you and it was someone else, what impact would that have? So fundamentally, you, and ask those difficult questions of yourself, ask those individuals, or get someone else, another peer or another line manager, to ask those individuals how would they feel about you, man, and making sure that when you've asked them, if it's not you, knowing who it would be if it wasn't going to be you. Okay, so thinking about the devil in detail in that, and thinking around, maybe it's another, maybe you can still keep it internal, maybe it has to be another manager or someone in another function or another part of the organization. And fundamentally, sometimes I see people make the wrong choice because they haven't asked the difficult questions of themselves as a manager, because sometimes you aren't the right person, right?
Yeah, it's having that personal insight, Enda, isn't it, really? And I suppose having the leadership capacity to say, well, I'm not the right person for that role.
Absolutely.
So another theme that's coming through, lots of chat, discussion between some of the attendees around volunteer organisations, Enda. So political organisations or other sporting bodies, whatever they happen to be, where they probably maybe don't have the processes in place. How would a volunteer broach the subject of conflicts in that organization, or even for a leader that's in that organization, the mediation process? Do you have any tips or insights from a volunteer perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a volunteer myself in many sporting organizations, and I'm actually on the board for a couple of mediation organization, Mediation in Ireland here as well. So in terms of the volunteer aspect, first of all, if money's tight and things like that, there's a load of brilliant resources out there who will give people the basics in mediation. Those reports, and CIPD, for example, have a whole, I think it's a 20-page report out last year on what mediation is and how, and what it isn't, and helps people really get underneath the skin in a way that I can only do in a little bit in this hour. Reach out to me, first of all, if you need to. I can give you some details and advice on that as well. But I know a lot of the sports bodies here, for example, Sports NI in this part of the world, have absolutely been chatting about and do provide mediation services. Some organizations, some voluntary organizations have that enshrined. Part of it, though, is having that. First of all, I often find that there's a real disconnect for people, because mostly when I go to people, here's mediation, here's this great way of dealing with conflict. People go, mediation, well, sorry, what's that again? I've heard of it, but I'm not really sure. So the first stage is an education element to let people know what it is, that it's not just about doing things when things have, when somebody's wrong, for example, and they're not accepting culpability, right? It's about relationships, it's about doing things better, and it's about future action oriented agreements. So education, there's great resources online for that. Give me a shout as well in the background. And it's about taking a step back, about looking at the system. Why is mediation not there? Is it because people didn't know, or as they've seen in the past, they've tried it, and for different reasons it didn't work, so it's left a legacy within that system, so which can be changed but takes effort.
Yeah, it's like everything in life, it takes the will, doesn't it, Enda? It takes the buy-in, and it takes the desire on both parties to really implement the practices that they want for the good of their people.
100%, Sue. And it's a voluntary process. I often think the voluntary nature of mediation at this level is one of its greatest assets, but one of its greatest difficulties, right? Because the voluntary nature means anyone can walk away at any stage, which gives it incredible power. But then at the same time, for mediators, can be incredibly frustrating for at times as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So Enda, for all the participants and the attendees that are on the call as well, something, we're all at different stages in our careers and personal development. Is there any one particular stage in our careers or leadership journey where we should take time out to really address our own skill set in terms of conflict resolution, negotiation, mediation? Are there particular touch points that we should check in over, say, a 20, 30-year career? What do you recommend?
Great question. For me, I think we can make the mistake to think this is something that we do once. Okay, we can make the mistake and say, you know what, my early career, when I was in my 20s or 30s, I did a really good mediation, conflict resolution, negotiation course, and it was great, and that's it. But for me, for example, you flex, you change, your sense of identity will shift throughout your career, because can shift on a monthly basis, right, for different reasons. So who you are now may be very different than who you are today, than who you were when you did that training. training, some of it has absolutely stayed the same. So I've seen a great comment there saying, you know, the behavioral change stairway model, it's been around for years, but it's still as good today. Some of the theories I'm taking, you know, from the Johari window, from things from the 1950s and 60s, they're still as relevant. So yes, some of those core theories will be the same. And yet, I'm a huge believer in neuroscience and in what we're now learning about how people's brains actually work in the real time. You know, if you did a training course a few years back, I guarantee you that the last 15, 20 years in neuroscience, it is completely different now, particularly with their view to emotions. So absolutely, there's an argument, I feel, for conflict resolution to be part of your early days career, but absolutely a big part of your entire CPD throughout your career.
Yeah, excellent, excellent, Enda. We're almost at time. We've got so much. The comments continue to come in. What we can do is we can call out some of the additional questions, guys, on LinkedIn. If you'd like to join the chat there, I know that Enda, we can pick up some of them. There are some really great questions. Of course, the only way to get unrivaled access of Enda is to join one of our courses. So Enda will give you his full attention. We have our Aspiring Leaders program commencing in a month. That's the 2nd of March. It is set up as a foundation leadership course. What I would say is we have lots of everyone on this program at different stages in their career. They're taking a step back. They're saying, I want to refresh my knowledge. As Enda said, what you learned 15, 20 years ago needs to be updated. So we also feature expert faculty from Queen's Management School. We have a business and ethics expert, Dr. Laura Steele, joining on the Aspiring Leaders program. All of our programs are currently online. They're in our virtual interactive classroom. If you feel that this session was interactive, you should see our programs. The negotiation and influencing skills is really a really intense deep dive into anyone that is negotiating from a commercial perspective, in terms of a relationship perspective, in terms of managing volunteer teams, whatever the role is. If you really want to take a step out again and look at your negotiation and influencing skills and gain lots of really practical tools, that one begins on the 15th of April, and our expert faculty comes from Oxford Said Business School, and we have a hostage negotiator from the Police Service Northern Ireland. So you're really learning from the professionals on this program. And then finally, as Enda mentioned, we're looking at a program in a few months' time. We'll be launching it shortly, conflict resolution and mediation strategy. So everything that we've discussed this morning, we can keep you all up to date with the on the email. And if you check back with our website, we'll certainly update you on social media. So we'd love to have you on board. Certainly everyone's really enthused about Enda and the topic itself. Our masterclass session continues on Thursday week. That's the 4th of February. We have Dr. Ulf Bosch, who'll be bringing us his strategies for making digital transformation succeed. This is a taster session to meet Ulf and to get to know about our new program, Strategic Change Leadership for Digital Transformation, that launches in March. So check in on our website. You'll find all of the booking details there. And connect with us. Love to hear from you on Twitter, LinkedIn, all of the social media. It's been our pleasure to have you on the call today. Really enjoyed the interaction. Wonderful to have Enda on board. Always great for interaction. And finally, we can't do any of this without the support behind the scenes, all of the team, and especially Rachel Lauder. So brilliant to have you on the call. Thanks so much. Hope you all have a great day and look forward to speaking to you on our social media channels. Thanks.
Thanks very much, everyone. Lovely to spend the morning with you. If you need us, reach out. Thank you, everyone. Bye.